Blakeney Chapel is a ruined building on the Norfolk coast of England. Despite its name, it is in the parish of Clay next the sea, not the adjoining village of Blakeney, and was probably not a chapel. The building stood on a raised mound or eye on the seaward end of the coastal marshes, less than 200 meters 220 yards from the sea and just to the north of the current channel of the River Glaven where it turns to run parallel to the shoreline. It consisted of two rectangular rooms of unequal size, and appears to be intact in a 1586 map, but is shown as ruins in later charts. Only the foundations and part of a wall still remain. 3 archaeological investigations between 1998 and 2005 provided more detail of the construction, and showed 2 distinct periods of active use. Although it is described as a chapel on several maps, there is no documentary or archaeological evidence to suggest that it had any religious function. A small hearth, probably used for smelting iron, is the only evidence of a specific activity on the site. Much of the structural material was long ago carried off for reuse in buildings in Clay and Blakeney. The surviving ruins are protected as a scheduled monument and Grade II listed building because of their historical importance, but there is no active management. The ever-present threat from the encroaching sea is likely to accelerate following a realignment of the Glaven's course through the marshes, and lead to the loss of the ruins. Description: The Blakeney Chapel ruins consist of an east-west rectangular structure S1 18 meters x 7 meters 59 feet x 23 feet in size with a smaller rectangular building S2, 13 meters x 5 meters 43 feet x 16 feet built onto the southern side of the main room. Most of the structure is buried, only a 6 meters 20 feet length of a flint and mortar wall being exposed to a height of 0.3 meters 1 foot prior to the excavation of 2004-05. The ruins stand on the highest point of Blakeney Eye at about 2 meters 7 feet above sea level. The eye is a sandy mound in the marshes that is located inside the sea wall at the point where the River Glaven turns westward towards the sheltered inlet of Blakeney Haven. Clay Eye is a similar raised area on the east bank of the river. Despite the name, Blakeney Eye, like most of the northern part of the marshes in this area, is actually part of the parish of Clay next the sea. The land on which the building stands was in the possession of the Calthorpe family until its purchase by banker Charles Rothschild in 1912. Rothschild gave the property to the National Trust, which has managed it since. There is no public access to the site. The ruins are protected as a scheduled monument and Grade II listed building because of their historical importance. These listings do not cover the land around them, but the whole of the marsh forms part of the 7,700-hectare 19,000-acre North Norfolk coast site of Special Scientific Interest SSSI because of its internationally important wildlife value. The SSSI is now additionally protected through Natura 2000, Special Protection Area SPA and Ramsar listings, and is part of the Norfolk Coast Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty (AONB). Documented history: The building was first shown on a 1586 map of the Blakeney and Clay area, apparently drawn to be used in evidence in a legal case regarding the rights to wreck and salvage, the outcome of which is unknown. The original map disappeared in the 19th century, but a number of copies still exist. In this map, the building on the eye is shown as intact and roofed, but it has no name. A map by the Cranefields from 1769 has the building as Eye House, but by 1797 cartographer William Fodden's map of Norfolk shows the chapel ruins, a description that was then consistently used from the 19th century onwards. Some maps, including Fodden's, show a second ruined chapel across the Glaven on Clay Eye, but no other documentation exists for that building. The medieval churches of St. Nicholas, Blakeney and St. Margaret's, Clay, and the now ruined Blakeney Friary, were not the first religious buildings in the area. An early church was recorded in the 1086 Domesday Book at Snitterley. Snitterley was a former name for Blakeney, the current name first appearing in 1340, but the 11th century church's location is unknown, and there is no reason to think that it is on the site of the chapel. An anonymous booklet on Blakeney published in 1929 states that there was a chapel of ease on the marshes, served by a friar from the convent, but the document on which this seems to be based, a calendar of patent rolls dated April 20, 1343, simply notes that a local hermit was given permission to seek alms in divers parts of the realms. There is no evidence of a dedication of any religious building on the marshes, and no mention of a chapel in any surviving medieval documents. Investigations: The first investigation of the chapel ruins, supported by the National Trust, was conducted by the local history group in the winter of 1998-99. This survey was conducted under a license from English Heritage that allowed access but did not permit excavation, so it relied on height measurements, geophysics resistivity, and magnetometry and molehill sampling. The area surveyed was 100 meters long and 40 meters wide, 109 yards by 44 yards. The magnetometry failed to detect the subterranean features of the chapel, but did show an unexpected linear anomaly, related to buried ironwork from wartime defenses. The resistivity survey clearly showed the larger room, but barely detected the smaller, suggesting that it had less substantial foundations, was probably less well constructed, and possibly later in date. Plans for a realignment of the Glaven Channel meant that the iron would be left unprotected to the north of the river, and would eventually be destroyed by coastal change. It was decided that the only practical course of action was to investigate the site while it still existed, and a preliminary evaluation was carried out in 2003 as preparation for a full survey in 2004-05. The surveyed area covered 10 hectares 25 acre, significantly more than the 0.4 hectares 1 acre of the 1998 investigations. 50 trenches were excavated in a herringbone pattern outside the buildings, each 50 meters long and 1.80 meters wide, 194 by 5.9 feet, and 6 trenches of varying dimensions were created inside the chapel. The latter equated in total area to 2 of the standard trenches. The geology was investigated with 8 boreholes, and geophysics, magnetometry and metal detection were used to locate subsurface anomalies. The major excavation of the site in the winter of 2004-05 concentrated on the building and a 10 meters 33 feet zone surrounding it. The results indicated that there were a number of phases of occupation. The remains of the building were reburied after excavation, so nothing is now visible at the surface. Archaeology. Early occupation. The earliest evidence of permanent occupation is a series of ditches of 11th or 12th century date which are believed to have formed an enclosure, the southeast corner of which lies below the chapel. Evidence for any buildings within the enclosure has either been lost to the Glaven or is buried outside the survey area. Few finds were associated with the ditches, although some fragments of Roman or earlier pottery and 3 Henry III pennies were found nearby. As elsewhere on the site, there is little evidence to link the old pottery to its location when found. By the time of the construction of the main building, sometime in the 14th century, the ditches had filled with sand. A small hearth was built at ground level, shortly before or during the erection of S1. It appears to have had fairly light use, but the presence of slag suggests that it was intended for smelting iron, perhaps by a smith. There was evidence for a number of small fires elsewhere in S1 at a similar date to the hearth, but whether they were related to the smelting is unknown. At this time, hearths could not melt metallic iron, but produced a bloom, a mixture of iron and slag which could be converted to wrought iron by repeated heating and hammering. Another, even earlier, smelting hearth is known from West Runton, 17 kilometers 10 miles further east on the Norfolk coast. The main ore in this area is the iron-rich local kerstone. Medieval. The larger north building was built without deep foundation trenches, but was nevertheless a solid, well-built flint and mortar construction. The building had substantial time and money spent on it in the opinion of the principal archaeologist. The flints were selected to decrease in size as the walls rose, and the internal corners were decorated with limestone blocks set as coins. Seashells were recovered, with a distribution suggesting that they were once part of the fabric of the building as galleting strengthening for the mortar. There were entrances in the west and northeast walls, and some evidence that there were once windows in the northwest and south walls. The floor was compacted soil, and the original roof material is unknown, but the presence of a few glazed floor tiles and Flemish pantiles of a somewhat later date is consistent with the higher status appearance. There was no internal wall at this date, but there may have been an external wooden extension to the southwest corner. The medieval building was eventually abandoned, and much of the structural material was taken for reuse in Blakeney and Clay villages. A stone archway in clay is traditionally believed to have come from the chapel, and would fit the western entrance, although it could have been brought from elsewhere such as the ruined Blakeney Friary. The chapel building was deserted around 1600, but whether the collapse of its east end was the cause or a consequence of its disuse is unknown. The main building seems to have suffered a major fire at some stage, and no wooden structures have been found. The site was flooded at least 3 times, subsequent to the building's collapse. At some stage, part of the western wall was lost, the steep slope where it stood suggesting that it may have been taken by the sea. Most of the pottery found within the larger room was 14th to 16th century, nearly a third of which was imported from the continent, reflecting the Glaven port's importance in international trade at this time. The pottery appeared to be mainly domestic in nature, including jugs and cooking vessels. Post-medieval. The 17th century room, S2, used the south wall of the existing structure as its own north wall, and was largely built using materials salvaged from S1, although the standard of the work was poorer. The new room had a double fireplace, but there was no evidence of a dividing wall between the two hearths. Limestone blocks, identical to the coins in S1, were used as structural and decorative features in the fireplace. In addition to the pan tiles taken from S1, there were Cornish slate roof tiles. Whether they formed part of the roof of S2 or were associated with the possible wooden extension is unclear. At the same time that S2 was built, a dividing wall, again of inferior quality, was built across S1 to create a western room. There were no molehills within the smaller building, which had suggested that, unlike its neighbor, it has a buried solid floor, and this was confirmed by excavation. This had a floor originally made of mortar, relaid at least once, but then covered with a layer of flint cobbles, suggesting that it was a working area. The old hearth was not covered, so it may have still been used. A new fireplace was also added, apparently of a domestic design, although the context makes that function improbable. A well-marked track led southwest down the slope from S1, and a large midden was close to the path. It has been suggested that a clean pit north of S1 was a well, with fresh water floating above the salt water below, a phenomenon known from Blakeney Point and elsewhere on the Norfolk coast. There is only limited evidence for use after the 17th century desertion, including a 19th century tobacco pipe and some Victorian glassware. A wartime barbed wire fence ran through the ruins, and was detected by excavation and magnetometry. Other modern finds included a gin trap, bullets and other small metal objects. Purpose: Blakeney has a long history of occupation, with many finds from the Neolithic, but few from Roman or Anglo-Saxon dates, although a gold bracteate was a rare and significant 6th century find. Animal and plant finds showed that both domesticated species, such as goats, and locally available prey such as curlews were eaten. Rabbit and canid remains may reflect the use of fur from these mammals. Evidence of cereal processing and storage is difficult to date, but may be medieval. The buildings were abandoned during the 17th century, and their uses, which may have been varied over the long period of occupation, remain unknown. The east-west orientation and superior workmanship of S1 would not preclude religious use, but there is no other evidence, archaeological or documentary, to support that possibility. The limited number of finds, even of material which could not have been reused, have suggested that any medieval habitation must have been very limited in numbers of people and time. Other plausible uses have been suggested, such as a custom house or a warrener's house, but again there is nothing to support these speculations. Threats: realignment of the River Glaven means the ruins are now to the north of the river embankment, and essentially unprotected from coastal erosion, since the advancing shingle will no longer be swept away by the stream. The chapel will be buried by a ridge of shingle as the spit continues to move south, and then lost to the sea, perhaps within 20 to 30 years. The ridge of shingle runs west from Weybourne along the Norfolk coast, before becoming a spit extending into the sea at Blakeney. Salt marshes can develop behind the ridge, but the sea attacks the spit through tidal and storm action. The amount of shingle moved by a single storm can be spectacular. The spit has sometimes been breached, becoming an island for a time, and this may happen again. The northernmost part of Snitterley village was lost to the sea in the early Middle Ages, probably due to a storm. In the last 200 years, the maps have been accurate enough for the distance from the ruins to the sea to be measured. The 400 meters 440 yards in 1817 had become 320 meters 350 yards by 1835, 275 meters 300 yards in 1907, and 195 meters 215 yards by the end of the 20th century. The spit is moving towards the mainland at about 1 meter 1 yard per year, and several raised islands or eyes have already been lost to the sea as the beach has rolled over the salt marsh. Landward movement of the shingle meant that the channel of the Glaven, itself excavated in 1922 because an earlier, more northerly course was overwhelmed between Blakeney and Clay, was becoming blocked increasingly often. This led to flooding of Clay Village and the environmentally important freshwater marshes. The Environment Agency considered a number of remedial options. Attempting to hold back the shingle or breaching the spit to create a new outlet for the Glaven would be expensive and probably ineffective, and doing nothing would be environmentally damaging. The agency decided to create a new route for the river to the south of its original line, and work to realign a 550 meters 600 yards stretch of river 200 meters 220 yards further south was completed in 2007 at a cost of about £1.5 million. Managed retreat is likely to be the long-term solution to rising sea levels along much of the North Norfolk coast. It has already been implemented at other important sites like Titchwell Marsh,